Okay, good morning, everyone. So we are going to start. So as usual, we are on a webinar mode. So people on Zoom, you can interact with the room using the chat to report any technical issue. And please use the Q&A tab for asking questions instead of the chat. And with that, thanks, Rémi, for introducing today.
Hi, everyone. So I'm happy to introduce Alexis Zimmer that I'm 3, 4, 5 years ago. It was a meeting organized by the Sciences Politiques here in Montpellier. And Alexis was invited to talk about the microbiome. And I was quite amazed about the fact that some anthropologists or people from the domaine social talk about microbiome. And so this is where we met. And so Alexis did his PhD in Strasbourg and postdoc in Belgium. And now he is in Strasbourg in the Medecine path, Faculty of Medicine. So he's organizing all the training that has been changed recently. So, but still, he's still doing research. So that which means that he's very efficient. So we are very happy to have you here.
Thank you very much, Rémi. Do you hear me? It's okay with microphone? Okay. So as I'm not very comfortable in English, I will basically read my presentation, but I will try to do it as long. So let's go. Thank you very much, everybody. I'm very glad to be here to present this forthcoming paper and to improve it with some biologists. I'm very curious about the way you will hear what I'm trying to tell here. So to quickly situate myself before beginning this presentation, I'm a historian and anthropologist of science, and since my doctoral thesis, my research objects have crossed the approaches of science studies. As you can see on this slide, the history and anthropology of biomedicine and environmental history. To question the reciprocal transformations of human bodies, health, and environments. I did this during my thesis, in particular through the historical study of an industrial pollution disaster known as the occasion of the first scientific demonstration of the mortality related to air pollution, the Meuse Valley, the deadly fog of the Meuse Valley. The idea was to question called first demonstration by situating this catastrophe and the knowledge to which it gave rise within a longer history of almost a century and a half of transformation of environment and bodies in this valley through its industrialization and concomitant transformation of lifestyles, bodies, and ecologies. This question of how our bodies, our biologies are historically transformed and how dominant knowledge account for this, I'm now seeking to question via the biomedical science study of gut microbiota. And to begin this investigation, I'm looking at two programs for collecting and preserving microbiota considered as endangered: the Global Microbiome Conservancy and the Microbiota Vote. I will come back to these two initiatives later. So I have two starts, but two possibilities of starting, and Remy said to me, take the second one. So I will take the second start, not this one, but this one. So in the field of research on microbiota in human health, a narrative has come to prevail, emphasizing the decline of microbial diversity and the disappearance of so-called ancestral gut microorganisms among the populations of so-called industrialized societies. Sweeping consequences on health have been attributed to this trend, which has been linked to an epidemic of chronic diseases. This narrative, which is referred to as the theory of the disappearing microbiota, is used to explain the dominant chronic and degenerative features of in the epidemiology of these populations. Now, what I would like to do is not to go back of the supposedly recent discovery of the determining roles and function of microbes in the field of microbiota studies, but to offer you a critical analysis of the story of their disappearance. A narrative of which Martin Blaser, the American microbiologist Martin Blaser, is one of the most fervent sources, as you can see notably with his famous book here, Missing Microbes, and which he has succeeded in forging and popularizing in a series of publications, a story popularized by press articles, documentaries, etc., to the point where it has become an essential motif in research and in the public existence of microbiota in human health. So, I won't go back over the narrative genesis, Here, I will simply mention the important role played by a growing number of studies on the intestinal microbiota of a diversity of human populations, from rural to so-called hunter-gatherer population in the global south, that have reinforced these hypotheses. Their gut microbiota are indeed characterized by a greater diversity and species absent from Western intestines. The supposedly imminent disappearance of these populations, the rural one and the hunter-gatherer one, of these population lifestyles is thought to herald the irremediable extinction of these microbiota, which should be, or they disappear altogether. So this narrative has given the impetus of two global collection and conservation initiatives. So the Global Microbiome Conservancy here and the Microbiota Vote here, and more recently, the Microbiota Vote. Their objectives include the collection and preservation of so-called endangered microbiota for the future knowledge and the advancement of public health recommendation. These collections and the associated research practices have raised multiple questions within the community of the biologists and physicians involved concerning the ethics of research and collections, who owns the collected biological samples and what happens to them, questions surrounding the inclusion and representativeness of varied human populations, whether it is pertinent to consider restoration practices on the basis of allegedly ancestral microbiota, as well as the use and the availability of the knowledge and techniques that would come out of this. Recently, anthropologists and historians have questioned the more or less explicit use of racial categories in the microbiota sciences. Others have singled out the discursive and techno-scientific colonial logics underpinning them. These critics have paved the way for broader understandings of the ways in which this science reenact, extend, and transform assumptions, way of saying and doing things that involve hierarchies, relation of power and domination between humans. They contribute to characterizing various aspects of what we can call, with some of the South American decolonial studies, the coloniality of the microbiota sciences, which can be defined as a purportedly natural subordination of non-Western places, humans, forms of knowledge and subjectivities, inherited from previous form of colonial domination. So building on this critique and drawing, oops, I forget a slide. Okay, but building on these critiques and drawing on tools developed in science studies, subaltern historical studies, and in the history of and anthropology of colonialism, this talk seeks to evidence how the disappearing microbiota narrative fits into this coloniality, acting as its discursive foundation of sorts and as its historical imaginary. So because, that's the right slide, because stories are not just stories, narratives are not just narratives. As feminist cultural studies of science have taught us, scientific practices of knowledge production are embedded in narratives, and these narratives are in no way neutral, as they bring into play broader socio-political motives and imaginaries that precede them. These narratives and the imaginaries they convey affect the work of researchers, affect your work as my work, the way in which knowledge is produced, circulated, and transformed. They informed the framework of practices, participate in the description of the situations, the definition of the problems, and delimit the range of possible answers to them. In the case at hand, the collection and conservation of microbiota from supposedly preserved human communities in response to the observed alteration of gut microbiodiversity. In doing so, as we will see, the narrative of the disappearing gut microbiota impacts both human communities and the microbes enlisted in this research, thus raising a tangle of political, ethical, and biological questions with scientists pursuing this research must learn to appreciate if they want to, must learn to situate themselves, the scientists must learn to situate themselves if they want to appreciate this entanglement of questions and problems. What it means situate oneself, it means learning to consider the position they occupy, its blind spots and implications, and to make it an object of critical inquiry in its own right. It also means learning to respond to them without presupposing that the so-called universality or neutrality of science gives them a free pass, or that they should only speak up on the scientific aspects, and notably because these very scientific aspects are from the outset also biological, political, and moral. This is an important and often misunderstood point in my discussion with biologists, because I work a lot with biologists in this field. Situating oneself does not mean denouncing this or that situation, or openly taking sides against, for example, the government of country that oppress certain populations that are the subject of collection. This can be done, but first and foremost, what is meant by this is the work of understanding the contradictions, injustice, and forms of violence involved in all forms of knowledge production practices, and more generally, the consequences and the researchers' position that follow from them. Importantly, this need to learn to situate oneself is just as valid for the researchers that I am. As I engage in this research, I cannot be satisfied with a distant critique of the disappearance narrative. The diagnosis of the scientist, the materiality of the worldly and ecological devastation that they indicate matters to me. This is why I also make a deliberate effort to take it seriously, to describe it accurately, and to do it justice, to pay for other narratives. The point here is accordingly not to dispute the diagnosis of a historical alteration of gut microbial ecologies, but on the contrary to offer a critique of the historicist, Western-centric analysis narrative that accounts for it, to broaden the historical and political horizon for its understanding, and in doing so, help bringing about the possibility of scientific narratives and practice that strive to depart from colonial logics. In fact, this is also a proposal for a critical analysis forged within a dialogue initiated almost 4 years ago with some of the scientists, not you, really, involved in one of these collection and conservation projects, the Global Microbiome Conservancy. And these scientists are very concerned about the unintended consequences of their practices. This learning about the socio-historical implications and power relations inevitably involved in scientific research requires, I believe, this kind of critical, frank, and long-term dialogue. So my presentation is based on a series of interviews with biologists involved in this field and stakeholders of the 2 collection initiative mentioned. It also relies on the analysis of the scientific literature in biology and biomedicine, in which this narrative on the disappearance of gut microbiota has been elaborated and discussed, and more generally, on the literature that attempts to understand and to pinpoint the consequences of the lifestyles and histories of human communities on microbiota. My presentation is divided into 3 parts, the heading of which you will find on this slide. I will begin by characterizing this narrative, gradually uncovering the forms of coloniality it implies, and enabling us to consider other possible accounts of the phenomena described by these scientists. Okay, let's begin with the disappearance narrative. So the reasons cited for the presumed disappearance of microbiota are manifold, and there are certainly a few of you who knows this perhaps even better than me. Much of the literature emphasizes on iatrogenic and biomedical reasons, such as the so-called overuse of antibiotics, particularly during the first 3 years of life, 3 or 5 years of life, it depends, and a purportedly excessive recourse to C-sections. Some authors explicitly reference to the hygiene hypothesis developed in the late 80s by British epidemiologist David Strachan, I don't know exactly how to pronounce this name, to point the nefarious role played by the expansion of hygiene rules and practices over more than a century. The more recent Old Friends hypothesis reformulates and complements this theory to account for the decrease in microbiota diversity and the significant increase in inflammatory diseases. More largely, a wide variety of lifestyle changes in northern countries that have led to multiple transformations affecting our relationships to microbes are listed in the literature. The transformation and urbanization of housing, the supply and chlorination of drinking water, the industrialization of food production, the considerable changes in the relationships between human and animals, altering microbial exchanges, etc. Post-industrialization, urbanization, westernization, modernization have been used somewhat indistinctly by biologists as generic labels to refer to the broader processes encompassing this joint transformation of lifestyles and gut. An explicit connection has been made with climate change, the 6th mass extinction, and the Anthropocene. The transformation of microbiota ecologies are considered as the means through which these long-term historical processes inform bodies and are inscribed in bodies by altering their health and biology, a signature among others of what's of a biology of history, as the historian of science Anna Landecker put it, a way in which human historical events and processes have materialized as biological events and processes and ecologies. Yet this narrative and these causes, whose chronology spans over 150 years, are embedded in an even longer term standard narrative, the anthropological narrative of the humanity's evolution. The life-threatening gradual drop in the diversity of gut microbiota and the concurrent development of modern diseases is thought to go hand in hand with the succession of stages of development, subsistence regimes, and of the revolution, Neolithic and industrial, they have witnessed the shift from hunting, gathering to farming, followed by the gradual continuous extension of urban lifestyle. This narrative and this image, among others, describe a gradual loss of ancestral microbiota that were perfectly adjusted to their host biology. In that way, the degradation of gut microbiota communities is presented as a biological marker of stages of development or civilization of the societies of those who carry them. The urban lifestyle, which is the most advanced in this line of human history eras, is equated with a decline in the diversity of the microbes. This paradoxically heralds the achievement of the modern agenda of the emancipation of human societies from natural elements. For indeed, this narrative is also the universal history of a literally antibiotic humanity, viscerally opposed to life, or at least of the life of its microbial companions. But these ancestral microbiotas have not yet disappeared entirely. Some so-called traditional or hunting-gathering populations believed to have remained on the sidelines of the previously described modernization processes are thus considered to be the living carriers of these microbiota. According to some estimates, however, by 2050, over 2.5 billion people will have left their traditional lifestyles behind to adopt urban ones. The extinction and generalization of this history of a gradual and supposedly unstoppable westernization of lifestyle and guts is what preoccupies these scientists. That's why these scientists have issued the following call. Most urgently, we need to preserve the diversity of ancestral microbes from globally diverse human populations, and especially include those who have had the least exposure to urbanization. Indeed, as exemplified by the figure, the disappearance narrative also comes with the techno-scientific promise of the possible resolution to this irreversible decline. This involves the elaboration of strategy to restore microbiota diversity, relying on the collection and banking of microbes from minimally disturbed traditional populations. While the natural slant of this history of humanity is an antibiotic one, sciences and technologies, which are key actors in this history of devastation, are paradoxically always seen as means to remedy this inherent defect. Scientists play the role of saviors, yeah, it's okay, of a biological decadent, inevitably damaged humanity. Okay, let's move on the second point of my argument. The waiting room of history, the coloniality of the disappearance narrative. So, beginning in humanity's infancy, the narrative of the disappearing gut microbiota spans over more than 10,000 years of history of the human species to account for the cure of gut microbiota in the urban populations of northern countries. Through the unproblematized non problématisées, and even in some cases, naive reiteration of these narratives or categories of description of historical processes, the underlying assumptions of the spontaneous historical theory and anthropology that inform this narrative are problematic in several ways. This is first because they tend to naturalize this history, to make it the outcome of a continuous, inevitable unfolding of processes or events fundamentally oriented or governed by a strictly Western telos, and whose realization determines the biological nature of the organisms that are its vectors. In other words, this narrative trace the outline of one or of a universal history, biological and cultural, of a humanity that is working towards its Western actualization, relegating the others, the not yet Western, to, as the historian Deepa Chakrabarty put it, an imaginary waiting room of history, which is full of microbes, and to the more antiseptic one, waiting room of the promised future of biomedicine. This narrative is a provincial one. Historically, it is connected to the European colonial project. To now use the word of the historian Serge Gruzinski, this distinctively European way of going back in time and constructing the past was a key instrument of Western colonization. By relegating the others, colonized peoples, to the past history of a common humanity. This is the point, the important point. Such narratives and their associated historicism had enabled European domination of the world. Colonization could accordingly be seen as the acceleration of an already ongoing history, a forced, anticipated integration of allegedly backward human communities. What disappeared as a result of colonial violence was in the process downplayed or even justified on the grounds that it was bound to disappear anyway at some point. As Patrick Brontlinger said, among others, the belief that savagery was vanishing of its own accord from the world of progress and light mitigated guilt. The belief that savagery was vanishing of its own accord from the world of progress and light mitigated guilt, and sometimes excused or even encouraged violence toward those deemed savage. Thus, the disappearing gut microbiota narrative is far from neutral. It is equally descriptive and performative. This narrative tends to naturalize the course of history and to downplay the violence involved in the supposedly imminent disappearance of lifestyles, forms of knowledge, ways of saying and doing things, in other words, of the worlds of human communities whose gut microbiota diversity has been remarked upon. The human communities concerned by this collection, and many, including the Northern Cheyenne, the Inuit in Canada, the Sami in Finland, the Baka in Cameroon, and the Hadza in Tanzania. What jeopardizes the plurality of these communities' current lifestyles is not so much the outcome of a natural, inevitable historical process as the continuation and the updating of various forms of stigmatization, marginalization, and oppression caused by the appropriation and exploitation of their lands and means of subsistence. In some cases, this form of oppression are typical of the capitalist frontiers. In others, of fauna and flora conservation policies, they exclude human communities. In every instance, they reflect the perpetuation of logics of appropriation and exploitation of territories that disregard the distinct lifestyles of the communities. It is quite difficult to comprehend these contemporary situations without considering the longue durée of past colonial oppression, which continues to shape them today. By naturalizing this history, the disappearing microbiota narrative prevents us from grasping the multiple political, economic, and colonial reasons underpinning simultaneously the alteration of microbiota ecologies and the repeated long-term attempt to destroy human communities. By silencing and negating this past and current violence, this narrative redoubles it. Okay, let's move to the third point. As Maria Dominguez Bello, which is a microbiologist involved in this collect and conservation project, the microbiota vote, as she states in the documentary, The Extinction, The Race to Save or Banishing Microbes, which is a documentary produced by Maria Dominguez Bello and Martin Blazer. So I quote, "We see answers where the problem has not yet begun. The capacity for anticipation claimed by these researchers is a characteristic feature of biomedical technoscience, based on the assumption of the inevitability of a universal history and the urgency to act that logically follows. It tends to point to the techno-scientific response of collection and conservation of gut microbiota as evident and necessary, and to present itself as one of the few, if not the only, credible alternative to disappearance." Still, for this response to appear as one of the best suited, one more ingredient is necessary. It is also a leitmotif in the colonial history of science, namely the denial of the value of the knowledge and practices of native communities, which are never mentioned in scholarly publications on that topic. As these human communities are positioned at a less advanced stage of the civilization process, their knowledge and their practices are negated, considered as worthless or worthless those of scientists from Europe. To be more specific and drawing on the work of the science studies scholar Jenny Reardon and Kim Tolbert, one may argue that this knowledge and these practices are neglected, implicitly disqualified and depreciated in that they are considered incapable of transforming a so-called natural resource into goods with a higher value for humanity in general. Then, as scientific practices and knowledge are positioned as resources at the end of that inevitable history, scientists appear to be the best suited to save what is relevant in what is otherwise disappearing. The integration of these diverse human and microbial communities as representatives of a previous period of this universal history of a common humanity constitutes their microbiota as a part of a shared heritage necessarily available to scientific research. All this allows to make evident and necessary the collection and conservation by scientists for, as I quote the first page of the website of the Microbiota Board, for long-term health for humanity of microbiota samples and the production in their name of data, knowledge, and practices deriving from it. This promise would, however, be meaningless without a material basis, which is provided by collection and low-temperature conservation techniques. Indeed, these technologies remain extremely incomplete. They can be used only to preserve some of the gut microbiota, those found in feces, and which are only fragments of all the microbiota located in the intestinal tracts. Those that cryopreservation and culturing technology was to preserve and reanimate It bears reminding the variety and multiplicity in the organism that makes up microbiota. That was the first exchange we had. You said to me, don't forget that there is not only bacteria in microbiota, but also bacteria, viruses, archaea, protists, whose conservation and culture cannot, for the most part, under the current practices, be granted. And lastly, that were collected at a specific moment, as microbiota are subject to temporal, daily, seasonal, etc. variations. These biologists admit that this response is largely lacking. And this especially considering that microbiota are not so much considered as the sum of the multiple of microbial entities that compose them, but rather as dynamic ecologies, sets of situated relationships that condition what microbes are and do. The biology of microbiota indeed tends to affirm the primacy of relationships over their terms. Or as the biochemist and philosopher of science, Ford Doolittle and Austin Booth have so lovely put it, it's the song, not the singer. The song comes before the singer, or rather the song makes the singer. The narratives of the disappearance of gut microbiota is therefore paradoxical, in that just as it allows us to grasp the inextricable intertwining of human and microbial histories, it downplays its importance by situating it within a purportedly inevitable universal history and proposing a strictly technoscientific response, the collection and conservation of gut microbiota samples. This narrative tells us something important that adds to the above and deserves emphasis. The disappearance that comes with the alteration of ecologies and the loss of some gut microbial strains is not so much about isolated microbial species, about empty spaces in their classification, but about the collapses of distinctive worlds and lifestyles. These narratives suggest that these worlds are full of interspecific relationships that produce ways of feeding oneself and caring for oneself and others, birthing and growing, ways of inhabiting territories and maintaining relationships with the multiple creatures that populate, or creatures or critters that populate and shape them. Different ways to live and die in worlds that are far broader than just those of humans, a fortiori of Western ones, and different ways to weave and tell stories. Borrowing the terms used by Ford Doolittle and Austin Booth, one might say that these worlds upon which microbiota depend are multi-specific ecologies, songs that demand, call for, replay, and enable other songs, and that make a home for the microbiota. The unraveling of these worlds and of their constitutive relationships are mutually constitutive. The consequences of their severance is that the biology of humans and microbes are transformed and embarked on a singular evolutive trajectories whose impacts are difficult to assess. To extend the metaphor, we might ask, what happens to the singers once they are deprived of their songs? This is certainly an enigma, but what is also certain by now is that to explore that enigma, the disappearing microbiota narrative is not useful. So, some words on conclusion. The consequences of this narrative are therefore not only discursive. It affects human and microbial communities both. Human communities become objects of collection around which scientific communities are built and consolidated, while microbial communities become lab samples and culture that serve as new methods for research. Research programs are developed and funded. Academic papers are written, knowledge is produced, and all of these practices outline a response to a global sanitary and ecological crisis. While these are only emerging practices, by using this narrative as a backbone, they deprive themselves from any sort of broader understanding of the underlying mechanism of the crisis. Ignoring the violence faced by some human and microbial communities, which are henceforth condemned as their distinct ecologies to an inevitable disappearance. But what is presented as inevitably is actually not a foregone conclusion. It depends on policies and historical logics that are contingent and as such liable to be altered, and that all narratives can destabilize or at least not reproduce. And a question we can ask is, with these narratives, who or what are we encouraging and facilitating to live, and who or what, as a consequence, are we leaving to die? Given all their consequences, it's important that we learn to describe and narrate more accurately the process affecting microbiota and the human lives on which they depend, as well as the practices and forms of knowledge applied to them. It is time to reformulate the call issued by gut microbiota scholars. We must urgently learn to produce another narrative on the devastation of microbial gut communities and the purported imminent disappearance of human communities that have kept their diversity alive. We must urgently learn from its lessons in our practice and to question its legacy and consequences. To begin doing this and support the biologists concerned by these questions, here are a few propositions that can be explored to start coming up with another narrative and exploring for their practice. First, we should no longer consider these human communities are representatives of a common past, but as our contemporaries, and recognize their deliberate choice not to partake in a Western history that has had devastating environmental and ecological consequences. These communities can be seen as historical proposals to exit this supposedly universal and inevitable history, rather than as a reverse, enabling us to temporarily delay some adverse consequences. As Kim Tolber argues, the world needs to learn to see indigenous peoples in our full vitality, not as the de-animated, vanished, or less evolved. Seeing us, seeing them as fully alive is key to seeing the aliveness of the decimated lands, waters, and the other non-human communities. Second proposition, we should no longer consider history in the making as an inevitable process, but as the outcome of decisions and processes in which societies and the scientists who live and work within these societies have their share of responsibility. We should no longer naturalize or negate what makes human and microbial communities disappear, but learn to describe the processes, decisions, and practices that contribute to these joint disappearances. In other words, we should no longer discuss the disappearance of microbiota without describing the worlds, the lifestyles, and the human and non-human communities affected by it. Third proposition, we cannot go on looking at the care and healthcare practices and knowledge of indigenous communities as secondary and negligible, whether implicitly or not. Many of these communities are bearers of knowledge and practices that do not dissociate the body and health from the broader milieu and histories. Rather than seeing the dominant sources of scientific knowledge as the only possible ways of understanding and devising propositions, we must put ourselves in the position of learning from these long disqualified sources. We have to work towards granting them their full scope instead of merely seeking to gather from them what could be useful for us. And last proposition, we should no longer promise techno-scientific solutions to situations whose implications extend far beyond this realm. This proposal would likely result in questioning certain logic or rationalities of research funding, and bringing attention to the fact that reliance on these solutions requires believing in a chimera or a liar. Trust us and everything will work out. Or in a less presumptuous version, trust us is the best thing to do. Yet, this would also require specifying what we could learn from these collections that wouldn't be based on this chimera and partake in a rationality of accumulation of things that one day might come in handy. These proposals are only initial, because in addition to being partial, they will only make sense if they come with transformation of the ways in which biology is practiced and knowledge is produced. For unless we want to keep perpetuating chimeras, changing our narratives inevitably means changing our practices. Certainly, this effort requires new types of alliance between scholars in biology and in the human and social sciences. This alone, however, will not suffice. In order to stop stealing histories, narratives cannot be written, and new ways of doing science cannot be invented without the agreement and participation of the human communities to which they pertain, and without scientists genuinely committed to learning anti-colonial scientific practices. And that's a lot of work. So let's collectively start or continue learning it right now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So some questions now. First in the physics and physics presence, and then we'll see.
Thank you for this talk. I had actually two questions, but so maybe I'll have the first one and later. But the first one is that I think it's more of a comment actually. It's like I think this discussion has been taking place in more generally than about microbiota. And I think it's a common discussion about basically every conservation practices. So I think it's been especially exactly the same kind of debate has been going on about conservation of crop resources, where there were opponents between this idea that you would actually store everything like in the Svalbard vault and this would be enough. And a lot of people are actually working on the genetic diversity of crops that are sometimes in minority in some research institutions, saying that no, it's not going to help to store everything that exists, and you need to conserve the processes that maintain the diversity and conserve the human practices that actually conserve this diversity. So I think this debate has been going on. It would be maybe interesting to compare how it plays differently with microbiota and other resources. But more generally, in conservation biology, you also have the same kind of debate with people that think that you can preserve DNA of endangered species and you will de-extinction myths about technological fix, and people arguing about like changing practices. And maybe
I agree.
Okay, so the second question was, I also have the feeling that the narratives in microbiota research are more diverse than the way you present them. And so I feel some of the research is already doing a bit what you're saying at the end. For instance, I think there I've seen some work looking at like within European population, how different practices and different habits change the microbiota. So there's no, like the colonial thing is not in there. There might be still opposition between rural and urban, but there's no irreversibility. I think there's a lot of discussion now about at least what kind of practice we can revert back to promote more diversity or to acquire the right species. And so I remember the popular book also called Let Them Eat Dirt. So there's also the discussion of how we can change our practices to preserve this diversity, and I don't think so. We somehow fit in there. I think it would be nice to able to show also the alternative way of doing research.
I completely agree with the first and the second question. that will be the next step of my research. The first step is what was, because I just began my research with the analysis of these two kind of collection practices to understand the implicitly narrative they command their practices. And this is just a critical analysis of the disappearing microbiota theory. That's it. And how this disappearing microbiota theory is shaping some kind of practices in the microbiota field. But you are right, there is other kind of narratives. There is a variety of narratives. And what I want to do now is to confront these narratives with other diverse and maybe more interesting and less colonialist narrative. So I'm completely agree with you. But just a point, I'm not sure I understood you well, but even in Europe, there is some kind of colonial logics in the way we practice scientific knowledge. You know, we don't have to collect biological samples on previously colonized people to reproduce colonial logics. In the way we in the lab, in the way we produce knowledge, the supposedly je cherche le mot, superiority, c'est les mots les plus simples qu'on oublie, superiority of scientific knowledge is a kind of, it has have an aspect of colonial logic. You know what I mean? Yeah.
What I'm not sure to see is that if you are comparing two populations in Europe and with different habits, like one lives in the countryside and one lives in the city, or one is using one population of children, went to some kind of health childcare, and you trying to do some epidemiology of the disease of the city's microbiota or diversity. When you're comparing the population, it's not completely clear for me that where whether you have a hierarchy between the, you're trying to see if diversity is different depending on habits and practices. Trying to test whether the practices are affecting the diversity. It doesn't necessarily mean to me that you are having
on hierarchies, I agree with you. But if you think that the scientific knowledge is the best way to compare and to say something very useful or not useful, pertinent on this question, this is a kind of colonial logic. That's all the point I want to make. I agree with you. There is nothing really colonial in the fact that to compare rural population in Alsace, I'm coming from Alsace, for example, and urban one. There is nothing colonial in that way of producing knowledge, but there is something colonial. Only I'm in a more je suis à un niveau de généralisation, je suis à un autre niveau de généralisation. I am in another level of generalization. I just said that thinking or believing that scientific knowledge is the higher knowledge, it's a kind of colonial logic. That's it. I agree with you, but I just want to mention this point. But we can continue to discuss if you want.
To make it brief, what about religion? Religion, yeah, the narrative.
I think that there is nothing about religion, unfortunately.
From my point of view, it looks like you have a kind of fixist view against evolution and ecological process, dynamic ecological process. I've seen the title was Noah's Ark, about the conservation of microbiota. And I mean, we have, even evolutionists, we have our narrative that is constrained by many religion things. If I take an example, one result of the human evolution is the date and the place of origin of Homo sapiens, which makes no sense. In population genetics, you have no place and date of origin of the population, the dynamic process. But we have this narrative, and it is a Western country narrative. And actually also coloniality linked to religion. So I see some link about what you said, some link with religion that might be interesting to think about.
I do not understand well your question. I think you asked me if religion have an impact on gut microbiodiversity. That's what so. C'est toujours rigolo d'ailleurs, on est tous en français là. Hein, puis, non, j'aime bien, on va continuer, ça m'entraîne un peu. But on your, I choose as the scientific knowledge, my knowledge is partial, relatives, etc. So I choose this way to analyze this and problematize this narrative without considering the religious aspects of it. But I'm sure that we can do, and there is some scholars who do this job in what we call the historicism. I don't know if everybody want see what it means. Historicism is the meaning that there is one way in history, and we are at the end of this history. We are the representative of the end of the history. We are the boss of the history in a way. And this narrative was invented in Europe, and there is a lot of work from historians, notably, and philosophers who established the link between historicism and other kind of religious narratives. I do not, because I have to be very consistent. Well, I choose this way of analyzing it because for me it was more powerful to indicate to these biologists attention, be careful, because the way you tell this story is very problematic, because you are just silencing the violence. This population are ils font les preuves. Enfin, voilà. That's, I know. J'ai été clear. I was clear. Not really. Ask me a question, and I.
I have two questions, in fact. One is, so we saw some very nice reviews, and so I presume it's somehow indicating that the people that are writing these papers are in place. But how big is the funding? How many? Is it a lot of people, or is it a lot of money, or is it just anecdotal?
For the Global Microbiome Conservancy, there is essentially 5-6 scientists really involved in the practice of collection and conservation practice in the lab at Keele University and in Boston, MIT. There's 2 labs mainly involved with a lot of partners in the world, because there is something like presently something like 38 human communities which is involved in communities, means scientific researchers in country where the scientists have but there is the Global Microbiome Conservancy is hébergé, so hosted the biggest stool bank in the world, which is States, and they are funded by all the open biome founders. So they have a lot of money. They have the technical infrastructure to give consistency to, etc. So this is not anecdotic. The GMC is really not anecdotic, because there is a lot of partners, a lot of funding, and all the infrastructural techniques they need. The microbiota vote is for 3 years now in their launch phase. It is more problematic because it's not exactly the same kind of collection practices. They are looking for, as the Salvard project, they are looking for a bunker in the Switzerland mountain. But the crisis, the Ukraine war stopped completely the possibility to have access to this kind of bunker because the Swiss military. No. Finally, at the beginning they were okay. They were open to this, to find a bunker to put the collection in the mountain, etc. But since the Ukraine war, that stopped. So there is a lot of funding too, and a big community. You just have to look on the two websites, and you will see that there is in Europe, there is something like 5 labs involved and really involved in this project. In USA, there is something like 5 labs too, and there have funding from 2 or 3. There is a Bill Gates Foundation on that. The exact montant amount, thank you, but it's not anecdotic. And it's not anecdotic because I saw this narrative, the disappearance narrative, in a lot of scientific presentation. Not just a slide, but as we know, the disappearance narrative, and so it really populates the imagination of the scientists.
Thanks a lot for this great talk, because for me, I'm working in ecology, and I think there is tons of topics that even maybe conserving biodiversity is, can be questioned. So I would be so curious to know if you plan to work on these more topics of like invasive species, what we call exotic invasive, all this conservation. What do we restore? What do we need to conserve because we are losing this? And it's, you said no more promises, but when I'm writing research to get money to research, I need to promise stuff, you know. So it's all embedded also in a society. We are scientists, we can do actions, but no, and it's all in this narrative, and I feel very uncomfortable narrative, but want to work on this, it would be really cool.
Just a comment to you. Thank you for your comments. Maybe you can continue to make some promise to the funding agency, etc. But yes, but only to them. We have to learn to ruser, less lying, and but taking seriously. Maybe make the experience what it means for me when I am a scientist, only to lie to the funding agency, but no, not in my practices, not in the way I really practice science. It's not easy, and it's la fabulation. C'est de la. You have to, you know, it's a real experience, like in the lab. You have to experience what it means if I do not make no promise. What it means completely, how it changed the way I practice science.
So maybe my question is related to that. So I'm not sure if I understand that the forum is talking about disappearing microbiota, because the microbiota are indeed disappearing, like diversity is crashing, and so this is a narrative that is also something that is really happening. So is the forum really talking about that and this story, or is the forum saying that the fix for that is storing things in the vault that we could fix it by this way? And this is about the premise as well. I mean, to me, I think I could still be honest with myself by saying that doing research on these things and trying to understand the determinants of this loss and you know, and basically how also you acquire those and what are kind of the environment of them is Me, I would say that it might help, starting with the parents, which is not so good. But I think that it's a wrong answer to say that colonialism in a spreadsheet is going to help. So I think scientifically, so there's a problem narrative, but scientifically, I also think that it's wrong to think that the solution, the technique, is going to help. It's not only a position, it's just like because I don't believe it's going to work. And so I'm not sure the issue is really specifically the disappearing microbiota narrative that may be very commonly said in every talk where you talk about the crash of diversity and the impact it has on human health to try to make politicians do something about it, but more about the solution you provide in this crisis. So what is your criticism about exactly?
Okay, I think we can't dissociate the story with the solution, because the story. Je peux répondre en français ou pas? Dites-moi, vous pouvez me dire non en fait. There is people in only. Okay, so I will. Sorry. Yeah. Okay, he's there. On Zoom there is just one people, so maybe she's. Il y en a plus? Oh, okay, sorry. Okay, so I think we can't dissociate a story from the technological solution. And thank you for your question, because it gave me the opportunity to clarify some points. First, when I begin to work on this theory, what struck me was that I read a lot of papers on the disappearing microbiota, and nothing on the community. The BACA is in a very fucking situation. The ADSA, the same. The Yanomani, the same. And the scientists have the habits to, okay, there is disappearing microbiota. No, you can't tell this story without make an effort to try to understand the condition, the causes, the logic of this disappearing. Why? Because if you just said there is a disappearing microbiota, this is inevitably history, you don't paint the violence these communities are affected by. You know what I mean? So it's not. Yes, I completely agree with the fact that our microbial ecologies in our gut is devastating. Who has not a problem in guts today? Fortunately, not today, me. So it's okay with you, but. And that's why I said in the introduction, this diagnosis matters for me really strongly, because it obliges us to consider the way histories, environment, the way we live, etc., affects our biologies completely. So this diagnosis matters to me. Yeah.
Yeah. Just to clarify this point, what do you? So because I have a doubt just now. What do you mean by disappearing microbiota? Is it disappearing globally, so that is in your gut, in our occidental gut, and also in everywhere? Or do you mean disappearing microbiota in that population that you were talking about, the BACA, etc., etc.? So what?
Okay,
there is a kind of ambiguity, so I would like you to just clarify.
Okay. I think, the way I understand these topics, that the disappearing microbiota, it's a global discourse. It concerns all the population in the world, because what this narrative says is that everybody is today all the people are confronted to the consequences of capitalist economy, extractivist practice, etc., etc. So, but you give me the opportunity just to make a little precision. I'm not thinking that to say that microbiota are disappearing, it's a good way to say. I mean, there is a lot, the way we transform our internal environment don't allow, thank you, don't allow a lot of microorganisms to continue to live with us in a symbiotic way. So it's not so a disappearance as a disentanglement of relationships. It's a bit different, I mean, because it is the way we eat, the way we live, etc. Don't care on relationships, and a lot of relationships which are participate through these ecologies. Ok. Maintenant, je sais plus où j'en étais là des questions. Je sais pas. So, okay, but to just give you the rest of my answer. So I think we can dissociate the story and the techno-scientific solution, because I think that scientists, and we too, me as anthropologists too, we have to learn to denaturalize the way we describe situation. You know what I mean? Denaturalize, it means be more specific. They are really specific in the way in the way they try to understand the ecologies of this strain or this strain and this strain. They are not specific at all in the historical and anthropological dimension of their work. Okay, they are not the scientists. You are not. I'm not formed in biology a bit, but you are not formed in history. And so we have to work together, and we have to be more specific for all the aspects, because these aspects are important if we want to really preserve this microbial diversity. Because if we just believe in techno-scientific solution, if they just rely on techno-scientific solution, we know that it can be effective. So if we want to act on the causes of the disappearance, we have to join our effort to describe more accurately and to name the violence. In a sense, we have to be more political in the way we do science. No promise.
So, but, okay.
Right. Okay.
Just like if you saying that if we work together with microbiologists and anthropologists and historians, we might understand better what are the.
We can try to understand better.
Oh, yeah, but just try.
It's not a promise. It's just. It's not a promise. No, it's just a new way to produce scientific knowledge without promise.
So we will, I think, stop somewhere. What I think your point is a kind of, it's difficult for us because we have the idea of the reductionism to explain general rules in life. And so you ask us to be less generalized, well, to allow less generalization somehow, because you tell us be more specific and be more situated, and our goal is, especially as in evolution, is our goal is really to explain the general rules. Right. Yes. And you ask us to get out of that, so it's very difficult for us.
Just 2 points. Firstly, yeah, and thank you for all your questions. Thank you very much. Just a precision. I do not give you a lesson. I also have to understand and to learn to see microorganisms the way you see them, etc., etc. It's more than a new kind of alliance we have to do together. I have some tools, which I mean is very strong to understand a lot of situations. You have a lot of tools too, which are very strong to understand some situation. But my tools, your tools are also very partial. C'est quoi le terme de partiel? Partial et partial. Un peu la distinction en français qui est vachement bien parce qu'en fait, bref, are very partial and that's what we have to learn together to see the partiality of our own tools, and to learn to try to respond better on the ecology, the huge of ecological crisis in this world, and that's we need to work together and to work with indigenous people and to decolonize our mind, etc., etc., etc. There is a lot of work, but it's very exciting. There is no promise. There is just a promise to learn better the world, not to save them, you know, not to save it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So if everyone wants to join tonight, we will go to a restaurant. So if you want to continue discussing with Alexis, just send me an email and I will tell you where we are going. And because we might be in the BSQ, near the Beaux-Arts. So if you want to join, you are welcome to join us. But it's not, yeah. We are not allowed to do publicity. So